At 4 o'clock in the morning of June 22, 1941, in lieu of a declaration of war, German forces crossed the western border of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, thus opened the Eastern Front of World War II. To the north, German forces captured the city of Novgorod and were soon approaching Leningrad. To the west, the Great Battle of Smolensk was boiling, and soon Soviet forces were being pushed back to the area of Vyazma, while the tank armies of German generals Hoth and Guderian were preparing to crush the defenders of Moscow. On the southern front, the coastal city of Odessa was surrounded and besieged by Romanian troops in league with the Germans. The fate of this city rested in the hands of the Black Sea Fleet and its ability to bring in supplies by sea. In September, Romanian forces managed to advance along the shore of the Black Sea to the west of Grigorievka village, and in so doing brought their artillery within range of the port of Odessa. It seemed the city was doomed. To save the city, Black Sea Fleet Command proposed a combined landing operation. A squad of naval infantry, supported by cruisers and gunboats, was to perform an assault landing on the shores near Grigorievka village. At the same time, a paratrooper sabotage group was to be delivered near Shitsli village. Thus, Soviet HQ hoped to demoralize the Romanian forces with a combined attack of naval and airborne brigades. In addition, 3 rifle divisions were dispatched from the eastern sector of the Odessa defensive zone to support the landing parties. On the night of September 22nd, Soviet ships entered position near Grigorievka. Their main guns opened fire, and Soviet commandos, highly trained men of war, directed their landing craft at the enemy-occupied coast towards a furious battle and the promise of a hard-earned victory. In December of 1941, German forces of the Central Group were stopped at the gates of Moscow and forced to pull back under the attacks of fresh Soviet reserves. This was a major failure for the German army, and Hitler was furious. His orders to General Manstein were strict and demanding: success at any cost. Thus, on December 17, 1941, German forces began an all-out assault on Sevastopol. The defenders of the city fought fiercely, but their numbers were rapidly decreasing. It seemed that nothing could stand in the way of General Manstein. Due to a series of fatal miscalculations by Crimean Front Command, in May of 1942, the German 11th Army successfully managed to carry out what became known as the Trappenyard operation. The Crimean Front was broken, and Soviet forces had no choice but to relinquish the Kerch Peninsula and retreat to Kuban. This enabled Manstein to throw the entire weight of his forces at Sevastopol. But the Sevastopol fortress was rightfully considered by the Germans to be all but impenetrable. Knowing full well the tenacity of the city's defenders, the enemy brought in heavy artillery in unprecedented numbers. Only with several hundred heavy guns aimed at the city could the Germans feel confident of their chances. In the face of this, Soviet command decided to form a sabotage group whose assignment was to infiltrate and destabilize the rear flanks of the German army. The group was to be headed by Senior Lieutenant Fedorov. Several major defeats in the spring and summer of 1942 were followed by yet further difficult battles at Stalingrad and Caucasus. It seemed the area of Novorossiysk and the Caucasus coastline were fated to fall to the enemy. A sudden USSR counterstrike rolled in like thunder along the Volga River. The steel claws of the mechanized corps gouged deeply into the flanks of the army of General Paulus. The Black Sea Fleet and the 18th Army received orders from General Headquarters to assume the offensive. In the early spring of 1944, Soviet forces in southern Ukraine were confronted by the German 6th Army of General Hollat. His troops were often called by the Germans the Avengers Army, as it was assigned the same number as the infamous army of General Paulus, which had been demolished not long before in the battle at Stalingrad. According to General Halleck's plans, the large port of Nikolaev was to serve as a forward base for the German army on the southern Bug River. By the 25th of March, Soviet tanks took positions near the port and began their attack, but met with heavy resistance and ultimately failed to drive away the Germans. In an attempt to weaken the German defenses and demoralize their troops, Soviet command decided to perform a surprise attack, while a diversion in the port was to be staged by a small landing party. On August 20th, 1944, the Red Army began its offensive in Bessarabia. The German and Romanian United Front was crushed in but a few short hours. Spreading west and south like fire on the wind, the Soviet tank corps soon reached the pre-war Romanian border. It was clear to all that the fascist regime of Romanian Prime Minister Marshal Antonescu was breathing its final breaths. Michael, the young king, took up the reins of the country during these final days in an attempt to save his homeland from impending destruction.